Hi, we're going to look at a Windows Form application that I've written that allows a program written in C# to access data in a SQL Server database, and we'll be looking specifically at an API or application program interface called ADO.NET. So I want to talk a little bit about what an API is, what database middleware is, and then relate that to what you know about both SQL Server and C#. So to start out with, I'm just going to run this program to show that it works, and I'm going to demonstrate the code that can be accessed by clicking on these yellow buttons. So in the first example, we're going to look at access to the HR SQL database that we've worked with extensively in class, and we'll be running a program that executes a SQL string. So you're going to see the actual SQL string in the program code, and that string will be passed to the database management system. The database engine will process the SQL, return a result set, and then the program's designed to return each row of the result set and populate a list box. So again, the SQL to do that is going to be provided as a string to the database engine when the call is made through this connecting software. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. And there it is. So C# program that connects to a database, executes some SQL, and provides the results set automatically because I'm doing this through the form load event. Okay, so I'll close that up. And then I'm going to do the same kind of thing here, but rather than having the SQL embedded in the program front end in the C# code, this time the program is going to make a call to a stored procedure, and then in the process is going to pass a parameter value to the database server, and the database server will execute the stored procedure. And again, the result set then will be transferred back to the client or to the front end row by row to populate a list box. And so I'm going to put in a value of 1, which is a known primary key value for the employee table, and I will execute the stored procedure, and it's returning a list of all the dependents of one of my employees. Okay, so there we have an example of 2 different programs that access a SQL Server database. So let's now take a look at Form 5 first, then Form 3, and see what the code looks like behind them. So when I look at Form 5, this is the one that contains the embedded SQL string. So if I look at the program code, there's a lot of documentation, and I'll spare you the agony of having me read that, but walk you through this kind of step by step. First off, you'll notice that I'm using try-catch, which is a good idea, because when I do this, I'm having to connect through 2 layers of software. The first layer is the standard API that's used in .NET called ADO.NET, and then the second layer that it interacts with is called the middleware, or the data service layer. And there is the possibility for a number of things to go wrong as that connection's made. So again, you know, if ever there was a need for try-catch, it is when you do this kind of programming. Now, you'll notice that there is a a reference here to SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader. Okay, so these are all ADO.NET objects that I am creating. So let's take a look at the using statements that are being referenced here. We saw this in CPSC 1500 for those of you that have taken that class, the CS2 class. We saw a need to look at the .NET base class library when we were working with the built-in classes in .NET that allow access to text files, StreamReader and StreamWriter. You might remember that. And in order to be able to conveniently reference those built-in .NET classes, we had to provide a using statement. Otherwise, anytime we referenced the class, we would have to reference it in a fully qualified way. So in this case, in the .NET base class library, you have it's a hierarchical structure, and the highest node in the structure is a namespace called system. And then if you can imagine this like a tree diagram, so at the top you have system, and then coming down from system are any number of other namespaces to include data. Okay, and if you recall from CPSC 1500, there was another namespace that was directly linked to the system node called I/O, and it was in the I/O namespace that we were able to reference both StreamReader and StreamWriter classes. So in order to conveniently use those, we had to insert a using statement that said using system.io. Okay, now I'm using classes that are 3 levels deep here in the hierarchical structure. System, top node, leading to data, and then in data, I'm going to change this just a little bit here. Go back and replace the dot. You'll notice that there are a number of options, and the option that was chosen was SQL client. Okay, so that's the particular type of data service that I want to connect to, or the particular type of database middleware that I want to work with. That's the data service, or the data middleware, sort of synonymous terms, that is used by SQL Server. If I want to connect to a Microsoft Access database, the middleware that it uses is called OLEDB. And so I would make a selection of OLEDB here if I wanted to connect Access. If I wanted to connect to an Excel spreadsheet or a DB2 IBM database or a Oracle database, then I would choose a more generic middleware option called ODBC, Open Database Connectivity. So this is kind of the universal standard. I could connect to SQL Server with an ODBC connection. The only problem is the SQL client middleware is really the preferred one. It's been optimized for use with SQL Server, so that's the one I want to choose. ODBC tends to be less efficient and have a minimum amount of functionality. So I would choose to connect to SQL Server, then SQL Client, and then at that point, if I reference any of these classes like SQL Connection, SQL Command, SQL Reader, they're going to be understood throughout my program. Otherwise, without that using statement, everywhere I say SQL Connection, I would have to say system.data.SQL Client.SQL Connection. and likewise have to do the same thing for SQL command, SQL reader. Okay, so hopefully that's understood. So what you have to understand is we have our program, and then our program needs to interface with the data service that's provided by the database management system. And rather than having to interface with that very specialized middleware, which would be different in connecting to Access, which would be different in connecting to SQL Server, which would be different in connecting to MySQL, which would be different in connecting to any other database management system, what I can choose to do is to choose a ADO.NET API that is appropriate for that technology, and then from the C# programmer, the application programmer standpoint, I do everything in a standard way. So the way that I'm going to end up executing the SQL command, and the way that I'm going to end up reading the data that's returned from SQL Server is exactly the way that I would do it if I were connecting to any other database. So what ADO.NET does is it provides specialized classes, but each class is designed to look the same to the application programmer. So if I ever need to switch technologies as I develop software, really all I have to do is choose the class from the .NET base class that is appropriate for that technology. Then everything I know about programming, everything I know about retrieving the data, updating the data in the database looks the same thereafter. Because, for instance, in this case, I'll create an instance of a connection object, and although this line of code will vary somewhat in this part of it, in what's called the connection string, from one technology to another, once I figure out what that connection string is, thereafter, to use that connection, I have a standard open method, I have a close method, and likewise for the command object, in this case, I'm choosing a SQL command as opposed to an OLEDB command, but once I create an instance of that command object, then thereafter, if I ever want to use it, if I want to execute the data reader object, I would, whether it's OLEDB, whether it's ODBC, whether it's SQL client, it's going to be this same line of code. So the only time that this changes for the application programmer is going to be in the using statement that's selected and in the specific details of instantiating the classes. Once the objects have been created, then from that point on, it is exactly the same regardless of what database management system I'm actually using. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's take a look at the specific details here. So what I have are three objects that are going to need to be created in order for me to perform the task of connecting to a specific database server, to connect to a specific table within that database server, to log in to that database server with a specific account. I'm going to need a connection object. Then, in order to execute the SQL, in order to hand off the SQL string to the database server, I'm going to need a command object. And then, in order to return the records from the result set after the database server executes the SQL, in order to retrieve those records to the result set and then return them to the program front end, in my case to populate a list box, I have to have a data reader object. Now this data reader object is going to be instantiated in a slightly different way than what you would expect. So I would instantiate the connection object and the command object in sort of the routine way using the keyword new, and then I create a variable of type SQL data reader but I don't instantiate it. I just create the variable, make it available, and then after I open the connection to the database, which actually creates the actual connection of the stream that's going to exist between the front end and the database, then once that's opened, I instantiate the data reader object by executing the execute reader method of the command object. So right there, when I execute the execute reader method, a built-in method in this .NET object, when I execute that execute reader object, it creates an instance of the data reader, which I happen to name obj reader. And at that point, I can invoke methods on the reader object in order to return data from the result set to the program front end. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and now I'm going to take it from kind of top to bottom here. All right, so let's take a look at, after I get into my try block, I create an instance of the first object, okay, which an instance of the first class, which I call obj connection, and it will require a very specific string to be passed to the constructor at the time that object is created. Now, for those of you that took CPSC 1500, this is going to make more sense. You'll know what a constructor is, have a better idea of what a constructor is, and you know that that's a special method that exists in a class that is executed at the time that the class is instantiated. So when that class is instantiated, when that .NET SQL connection class is instantiated, it will take this string, parse it, and perform whatever's necessary. And again, that's kind of proprietary, Microsoft proprietary stuff at that point. But it's going to perform whatever task is necessary in order to make the connection to this database possible. Now, what kind of things does it need to know? It needs to know the name of the server, and if the server resides on the local machine, it can be referenced as data source equal local. Okay, so that's a reference to my database server. Otherwise, I have to put in either a UNC path, or I think I can even put in a IP address. I haven't done that for so long, I can't really tell you. But for our purposes, as we do this on a development machine where the database server is running on the same computer as the program that we're trying to connect with, we would reference that local installation by the keyword local. Following that, we have to specify the keyword initial catalog and then set it equal to the name of the database that we want to use on that database server that's specified through the data source. So I'm going to be using the HRSQL2 database as opposed to the Northwind Convert database and so forth on my local computer. Then I have to provide the account that I want to log in under, and for development purposes, SA is fine. Once the software goes into production, then likely you're not going to be using SA. You're going to be using some other account that has less permissions than the SA account. And then you also have to provide the password. So that's going to be the same password that you would log into through Management Studio. All right, so I have wired up the connection, but I haven't actually connected yet. There's still a method that I have to employ on this object. But at this point, I've wired the connection class, and then when I instantiate it, that object, OBJ connection, is going to be designed to interact specifically with the local server's HRSQL to database through the SA account. The next class that's instantiated is the SQL command class, and this is where if I am passing an SQL string, is where I'm going to wire up the SQL. Okay, so I can do whatever's necessary here, okay, to create an SQL statement, and that could involve some string concatenation. So that first argument that you see, which is an SQL string, could have been assigned to a string variable. It could have taken some input from text boxes and done some string concatenation to create some dynamic SQL statement, but either through a string literal or through a string variable that's been wired up in some kind of complex way, there needs to be a string that represents the SQL command. And in this case, I'm doing an inner join between the employee table and the depend table. Okay, so you can see also that what's important here will be to understand that when I do this, notice that there's 1, 2, 3 columns that are going to be returned with each row: last name, first name of the employee, and the first name of the dependent. So there's 3 columns. Keep that in mind because that'll become an issue here in a moment. All right, so I do a join. Now there's 2. Whenever and here's the thing about ADO.NET, there are a multitude of ways that you can configure these statements, and that's kind of what makes this difficult to wrap your head around at first. Is what we're doing is we're wiring up all these components in a standard way in our application program, but the way we wire them up can be slightly different from one occasion to the other. So there's some variations on how we can do this. With this particular variant, I'm using a embedded SQL string as the first argument when I instantiate the command class, and I'm using the name of the previously created connection object, OBJ connection, OBJ connection. So my connection object is the second argument. Okay, so when it eventually executes the SQL, it's going to know which connection to do it under. Okay, and so I've wired up the command object. I've passed all this over to the constructor. Okay, so again, creating a new instance of the SQL command, and then I create this variable called OBJReader. That's of SQL data reader type, but I haven't instantiated it. Next thing I do is use my connection object and invoke the open method on it. Okay, so for those of you that have had CPSC 1500, you recognize that is a public void type method. Okay, so I didn't write it, but I can see from the way the statement's written that that's a public void type method. So it's going to do something. Whatever it does exactly on the other end is Microsoft secret stuff, but it's going to invoke this open method, and now I've got a connection to the database. So I've got a stream between the program and the database server, and then when I execute the next method, this is a return type method. Okay, so what's it going to do? It's going to execute the SQL and return an object to OBJReader. Okay, so this is kind of weird the way this works, but it's a return type method. It's going to then in the process, transform this variable, which was previously declared of this type, to an actual object. At this point, OBJReader is an object, and thereafter I can invoke methods on that object, which is what I do through a while loop here. Okay, so this is really the meat of the whole thing. I've wired everything up. I've got all the objects in place. It's executed the SQL on the server. The result set is sitting there. And now how do I return the rows from the result set? I return them one row at a time through this data reader object. And this is very similar to a fast forward cursor. It's going to step through every row. Every time I execute the read method, it's automatically going to advance the row pointer to the next row in the result set and grab the next row with the subsequent read. So notice that this is a public return type method. It might not be real clear the way it's used in the context of this while statement, but this is a return type method. It's going to go do something. It's going to grab a record out of a result set, and it's also going to return either true or false. And this is how I'm going to break out of the loop eventually. Whenever it finally, much like a fast forward cursor, once it finally hits the end of the result set, it's going to return a false and get me out of the while loop. So with each read, I can access the individual columns that are read through an index value associated with the reader. So OBJ reader sub 0 here corresponds with the employee column in the SQL statement. And notice that that is indexing with a base value of 0. So I have 0, 1, and 2. Okay? And so I'm reading all three of those columns, and I can access the columns. I can choose to display, the columns or not display the columns. I can change the order of the columns in the statement and so forth. So if I wanted to put that dependent's first name in the list box, in the first column of the list box, I could have written this as OBJReader sub 2 instead of 0. So here it's going to give me the last name of the employee, the first name of the employee, followed by the first name of the dependent. But I could shift all that around by just, reordering these things. And it's going to add them to the list box, and then the rest of that stuff is just a lot of window dressing. It's using some padding to create some spaces in between the columns, and that's not terribly important. It's just cosmetic. So it's going to continue to go through the while loop, and then eventually it's going to close, and you'll notice my comment that says unnecessary because the local variable was used, and when this local variable then dies off as the method ends, it would automatically clear out all these objects. So by using local variables as instances of my ADO.NET classes, I'm going to make them very short-lived. They're going to use resources, efficiently. They're not going to be hanging around, sucking up memory and that kind of thing. I should tell you that by the time you actually see what's going on, it has already created the objects, made the connection to the database server, executed the SQL, and populated the list box row by row in that loop, then disconnected and killed off all of the resources by the time you ever see this, because this code was placed in the form load event. Now, if you recall anything at all about CPSC 1400, we could argue whether we should put this in the form load event directly, or whether we should make it our own private method and call it up from form load. Either one of those things could have been done. All right, so that is a quick overview of how this program